Chapter 1. Slow and steady, Chris Thompson had never been the kind of man to rush into anything, especially not love. At 31, he had learned enough hard lessons to know that marriage wasn't just a romantic leap. It was a legal contract with the potential to slice your life in half if things went wrong. He'd seen it happen to friends, watched them lose houses, savings, and sometimes even their sanity. So when Carol Bennet came along, bright-eyed and easygoing, he promised himself one thing: take it slow. And so far, slow had been good. 5 months of dinners, movies, weekend walks, and late-night conversations had built something steady between them. Carol was fun, quick with a joke, and had a way of making even the most ordinary moments feel like they mattered. She wasn't clingy, didn't play games, and, thank God, didn't talk about wedding Pinterest boards on date 2. Tonight, Chris sat across from her at a cozy Italian restaurant, swirling his glass of Chianti as she told a story about her co-worker's disastrous attempt at baking bread. So then, Carol said, laughing. She sends a picture to the group chat, and I swear, Chris, it looked like a meteorite, black, cratered, like it had been through re-entry. Chris chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Maybe she was just trying to make artisanal bread. Rustic, charcoal chic. Carol grinned. If by chic you mean a fire hazard, then sure. He loved that about her. The way she could turn a simple anecdote into something that made him laugh until his cheeks hurt. It wasn't just the humor, though. It was the ease. With Carol, conversation flowed like water. No awkward silences. No forced small talk. Just natural. As the waiter cleared their plates, Carol reached for her wine, her expression softening. So, my dad wants to meet you. Chris froze mid-sip. Your dad? Yeah. She tilted her head, watching his reaction. Don't look so terrified. He's great. You'll like him. Chris set his glass down slowly. Meeting the parents was a milestone, a big one. Not marriage big, but definitely a step that said this is serious. He wasn't against serious. He just liked to know what he was walking into. When? He asked, keeping his tone casual. Next weekend, Carol said. Dinner at his place. He's already planning the menu. Chris nodded, masking the flicker of nerves with a smile. Sounds good. Carol reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. Don't worry. He's not like my mom. Chris raised an eyebrow. Should I be worried about your mom? Carol laughed a little too quickly. No, she's just different. You'll see. Later that night, Chris drove home through quiet streets, the city lights blurring past his windshield. He thought about Carol's laugh, the way her eyes crinkled when she teased him, and felt that cautious optimism stir again. Maybe this was different. Maybe she was different. He parked outside his apartment, sat for a moment with the engine off, and let the silence settle. He wasn't naive, relationships were work, and people came with baggage. Carol had mentioned her parents' divorce early on, said she had a good relationship with both, but he knew those scars didn't vanish. They lingered, shaping expectations, fears, and sometimes entire worldviews. Still, 5 months in, he liked where things were headed. Slow and steady. No rushing. No blind leaps. Next weekend, he'd meet her dad. And maybe, just maybe, he'd leave feeling like this was a risk worth taking. Chapter 2. Dinner with Dad. Chris stood outside the modest brick house, bouquet of fresh lilies in one hand and a bottle of Cabernet in the other, wondering if he looked like a man about to propose instead of a man about to meet his girlfriend's father. He dressed carefully. Dark jeans, crisp button-down, blazer that said I'm responsible but not boring. The lilies were Carol's idea. The wine was his insurance policy. Carol appeared at his side, her smile bright against the cool evening air. Relax, she whispered, slipping her arm through his. He's going to love you. Chris exhaled slowly. That's what they all say before the interrogation starts. Carol laughed, tugging him toward the door. My dad doesn't interrogate. He tells stories. Lots of them. The door swung open before Chris could reply, revealing a tall man with silver hair and a grin that could light up a stadium. You must be Chris, he boomed, extending a hand that looked like it could crush walnuts. Chris shifted the wine to his left hand and shook firmly. Nice to meet you, Mr. Bennet. Call me Tom, the man said, clapping Chris on the shoulder like they were old friends. Come in, come in. Carol's been talking about you. Chris shot Carol a quick glance. She winked. Inside, the house smelled like heaven, garlic, herbs, something roasting in the oven. The kind of smell that made you want to cancel all your plans and just eat until you couldn't move. Tom led them to the kitchen, where a pot of sauce simmered on the stove and a loaf of bread cooled on the counter. Hope you're hungry, Tom said, grabbing the wine from Chris and inspecting the label. Cabernet? Good man. You know your reds. Chris smiled. I try. Tom poured 3 glasses and handed them out. To new friends, he said, raising his glass. To new friends, Chris echoed, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease a little. Dinner was a feast. Perfectly cooked pasta, tender roast, bread that tasted like it had been kissed by angels. But the real show was Tom. The man could tell a story like nobody's business. Halfway through the meal, Chris was laughing so hard his sides hurt. And then, Tom said, eyes twinkling, Carol decides she's going to run away. Packs a bag. marches out the front door like a soldier on a mission. She makes it as far as the mailbox before she realizes she forgot her stuffed rabbit. Comes back in, grabs it, and announces, "Now I'm really leaving." Carol groaned, covering her face with her hands. "Dad." Chris grinned. "Did she make it past the mailbox the second time?" "Barely," Tom said, chuckling. "She got to the end of the street before hunger kicked in. Came back for a sandwich." Carol peeked at Chris through her fingers. "I was 6. Old enough to know better," Tom teased. Chris laughed, feeling something warm settle in his chest. This was what he'd hoped for. Easy conversation, genuine laughter, no hidden agendas. Tom wasn't sizing him up like a suspect in a crime drama. He was just welcoming. After dinner, they moved to the living room with coffee and dessert. Tom launched into another story, this one about Carol's first attempt at driving, which apparently involved a mailbox and a very angry neighbor. Chris listened, amused, but also quietly relieved. If this was the family dynamic, he could handle it. When it was time to leave, Tom shook his hand again, firm and friendly. "You're good people, Chris. Don't let my daughter boss you around too much." Carol rolled her eyes. "Ignore him." Chris smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." On the drive back to Carol's apartment, Chris felt lighter than he had in weeks. "Your dad's great," he said. "I think I laughed more tonight than I have all month." Carol grinned. "Told you." Chris glanced at her, the streetlights painting her face in soft gold. "If your mom's anything like him, I'm in for a treat." Carol hesitated just for a second. "Yeah, about that." Chris raised an eyebrow. "That bad?" She gave a small, sheepish smile. "She's different." Chris chuckled. "Define different." Carol stared out the window. "You'll see." Chapter 3. The mother factor. Chris had a bad feeling before he even rang the doorbell. It wasn't the house. Carol's mother lived in a charming 2-story with a manicured lawn and flower boxes that looked like they belonged in a magazine. It wasn't the weather either. The evening was crisp and clear, the kind of night that begged for laughter and good food. No, the feeling came from Carol's tone when she said, "Don't worry. She's just protective." Protective. Chris had learned that word was often code for difficult. Carol smiled at him now, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Ready?" Chris forced a grin. "As I'll ever be." The door opened, and there she was, Linda Bennet, tall, elegant, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her gaze swept over Chris like a scanner at airport security, and he felt the weight of every judgment she wasn't saying out loud. "Chris," she said, her voice smooth but cool. "Finally. Carol's told me so much about you." "Good things, I hope," Chris replied, offering the bouquet of lilies he'd brought. Linda accepted them with a polite nod. "They're lovely. Thank you." She turned to Carol. "Put these in water, dear." Carol shot Chris a quick, reassuring smile before disappearing into the kitchen. Linda gestured toward the dining room. "Come in." The table was set beautifully. White linens, polished silverware, candles flickering in crystal holders. It should have felt warm and inviting. Didn't. Chris sat where Linda indicated, acutely aware of her eyes on him like a hawk circling prey. "So, Chris," she began, folding her hands on the table. "What do you do?" "I'm in software development," Chris said, keeping his tone light. "Mostly back-end systems." Linda tilted her head. That sounds technical. Not very creative, though, is it?" Chris smiled faintly. "Depends on how you look at it. Solving problems can be pretty creative." Linda's lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. "I suppose. Though I've always thought creativity was more artistic." Chris took a sip of water, reminding himself to stay calm. This wasn't an attack. Not yet. Just probing. Carol returned, sliding into the seat beside him. "Mom, Chris is great at what he does. He's helped companies save thousands." Linda's gaze flicked to her daughter, then back to Chris. "That's nice. Stability is important, especially these days." Chris nodded, biting back the urge to point out that stability was exactly what he brought to the table. Instead, he focused on the roast chicken Linda was carving with surgical precision. Dinner began, and for a while, conversation stayed neutral. Weather, local events, a funny story from Carol's office. But every time Chris spoke, Linda's questions had an edge, like she was testing for weaknesses. "Do you own your home? Planning to stay in your job long-term? Ever thought about going back to school? A master's degree can open doors." Chris answered politely, but inside, he felt like he was sitting for an exam he hadn't studied for. Carol tried to smooth things over, laughing, changing the subject, but Linda always steered it back. By dessert, Chris was exhausted. He'd smiled, nodded, and swallowed every passive-aggressive jab like bitter medicine. When they finally stood to leave, he felt like he'd run a marathon. In the car, silence stretched between them until Chris spoke. "Your mom doesn't like me." Carol sighed, staring out the window. "She's always like that. Don't take it personally." Chris gripped the steering wheel. "Carol, she spent half the dinner asking questions that sounded like a job interview. She just wants to make sure you're good for me," Carol said softly. "She'll settle down." Chris didn't answer. He wanted to believe her. He really did. But he knew people rarely changed their behavior. And Linda Bennet? She didn't strike him as the settling down type. Chapter 4. The passive-aggressive marathon, 3 months. That's how long Chris lasted before the dinners started feeling like endurance tests. It wasn't that Linda Bennet was openly hostile. She never raised her voice, never said anything that could be quoted as an insult. No, her weapon of choice was subtler. Passive-aggressive commentary, sharpened like a blade and slipped between the ribs with a smile. The first time, it was about men in general. They just don't commit anymore, Linda said one evening, swirling her wine like a philosopher pondering the mysteries of life. Always afraid of responsibility. It's a shame, really. Chris had smiled politely, even though the remark landed like a dart aimed squarely at his forehead. Carol had jumped in, laughing nervously. Mom, not every guy is like that. Linda's lips curved. Of course not, dear. Present company excluded, hopefully. Chris had taken a slow sip of his water, reminding himself that silence was sometimes the best defense. The second time, it was about careers. You know, Linda said as she passed the salad bowl, I read an article about how tech jobs are being automated. AI taking over everything. Makes you wonder what people in software will do when the machines replace them. Chris had smiled again, though his jaw tightened. Well, someone has to build the AI. Linda's brows lifted, as if impressed by his optimism. True, until the AI learns to build itself. Carol had shot him an apologetic glance across the table, her eyes saying please don't take the bait. He didn't, but it was getting harder. By the third month, Linda had perfected her technique. Every dinner came with a side of commentary about divorce rates, financial security, men who just can't handle strong women. None of it aimed directly at Chris, but the implication was clear enough to sting. Chris tried talking to Carol after each visit. She'll settle down, Carol said every time, her voice soft, her hand resting on his arm like a peace offering. She just needs time. Carol, Chris said one night as they sat in his car outside her apartment. I've given her time. 3 months of time. I'm starting to feel like I'm auditioning for a role I didn't sign up for. Carol sighed, leaning her head back against the seat. She's protective. After the divorce, she doesn't trust easily. Chris stared at the dashboard, the glow of the streetlights painting his hands in pale gold. I get that. I do. But there's protective and then there's sabotage. Carol turned to him, her eyes pleading. She's not trying to sabotage us. Chris didn't answer right away. He wanted to believe her. He really did. But he knew people rarely changed their behavior. And Linda Bennet? She was doubling down. The next dinner was the worst yet. Linda greeted him with that same polished smile, ushered them in, and immediately launched into a story about her friend's daughter. Such a smart girl, married a doctor, never has to worry about money. Chris sat through it, nodding, his patience stretched thin like a rubber band about to snap. When dessert came, Linda dropped her latest gem. You know, Carol, relationships are like investments. You have to choose wisely. Some assets appreciate. Others depreciate. Chris set his fork down slowly, his pulse ticking like a metronome. He didn't explode. He didn't even frown. He just smiled. A calm, measured smile that Carol recognized instantly as dangerous. On the drive home, he spoke quietly. Carol, I'm not sure how much longer I can do this. Her voice was barely a whisper. Please, just a little longer. She'll come around. Chris gripped the wheel, staring at the road ahead. I hope you're right. But deep down, he knew hope was a fragile thing. And Linda Bennet was very good at breaking fragile things. Chapter 5. The setup. Chris should have trusted his gut. When Carol called earlier in the week, her voice was bright, almost too bright. Mom wants us over for dinner again, she said. She's inviting a friend from work. It'll be fun, less pressure. Less pressure. Chris clung to those words like a lifeline. Maybe Linda was finally softening. Maybe this was her way of extending an olive branch. He wanted to believe that. He really did. But the moment they stepped through the door, Chris knew something was off. Linda greeted them with a smile, an actual smile that reached her eyes. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked pleased. And that was the problem. Linda Bennet didn't do pleased without a reason. Carol, Chris, she sang out, ushering them inside. Come in, come in. Everyone's already here. Everyone? Chris frowned. Carol had said her mom's friend would be there. Singular. But as they entered the dining room, Chris counted 3 extra chairs and 3 extra people. Linda's friend sat at the table, chatting animatedly. Beside her was a man in his early 30s, sharp suit, polished shoes, the kind of guy who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate brochure. His smile was polite, his posture perfect. And next to him, his mother, who looked just as surprised to be there as Chris felt. Carol froze for half a second before recovering with a smile that didn't quite hide her confusion. Mom, I thought it was just you and your friend. Linda waved a hand, breezy as a summer breeze. Oh, plans changed. This is Diane, and her son, Mark. He's in finance, very successful. Chris felt the first crack in his composure. He didn't say anything, just nodded politely as introductions were made. Mark shook his hand with a firm grip, his expression friendly but wary, like he'd walked into a situation he hadn't signed up for either. Dinner began, and for a while it was civil. Linda played hostess, passing dishes, pouring wine, laughing at Diane's stories. Chris kept his tone light, his smile steady, even as his instincts screamed that something was wrong. Then it happened. They were in the living room after dinner, coffee cups in hand, conversation drifting toward work. Diane mentioned a project at her office, and Linda seized the opening like a hawk spotting prey. "Oh, speaking of work," Linda said, turning to Mark with a smile that could blind. "Tell us about your promotion. Such an impressive achievement." Mark shifted uncomfortably. Yeah, I was promoted to senior analyst last quarter." Linda's eyes gleamed. "Isn't that wonderful, Carol? A man with ambition, stability, and a real future." The room went silent. Carol's face drained of color. Diane stared at Linda like she'd just slapped someone. Mark looked like he wanted to melt into the couch. Chris didn't move, didn't flinch. He just took another slow sip of coffee, set the cup down gently, and stood. Carol turned to him, panic in her eyes. "Chris," he met her gaze calm and steady. "I can't do this anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke. No anger, no drama, just quiet finality. Chris reached for his jacket, slipped it on, and walked to the door without a backward glance. Behind him, voices rose. Carol's sharp with shock, Linda's defensive, Diane's mortified. But he didn't listen. He stepped into the cool night, the door closing softly behind him. For the first time in months, Chris felt free. And yet, as he walked to his car, a hollow ache settled in his chest. He hadn't wanted it to end like this. He'd liked Carol, really liked her. But some battles weren't worth fighting. And Linda Bennet? She just made sure this was one of them. Chapter 6. The bombshell fallout. Carol stood frozen in the living room, her coffee cup trembling in her hands. The door had closed behind Chris with a soft click, but the silence it left behind was deafening. "Carol," Linda began, her voice smooth, almost soothing. Carol spun on her mother, eyes blazing. "What was that? What was that, Mom?" Linda blinked, feigning innocence. "I don't know what you mean." "You don't." Carol's laugh was sharp, brittle. "You just humiliated me." "You humiliated him." Linda's brows arched, calm as a saint. "I was simply pointing out that Mark is a good man, ambitious, stable." Carol's voice cracked. "Like Chris isn't?" Linda sighed, setting her cup down with deliberate grace. "Chris seems fine. But fine isn't enough, Carol. You deserve someone exceptional." Carol stared at her mother, words choking in her throat. "You think I don't know what I deserve?" Linda's expression softened, but her tone stayed firm. "Sweetheart, I'm trying to protect you. After what your father put me through." "This isn't about Dad," Carol snapped. "This is about you not trusting me to make my own choices. But since you want to bring up Dad, sure, let's talk about that. Mom, you divorced Dad after you started spending all your time with your divorced friends. Dad didn't do anything but try to keep our family working while you forgot where you lived. Now all these years later, you're still blaming Dad for a decision you made. You're only angry that he's happy without you." Diane shifted awkwardly on the couch, clearly wishing she could vanish. Mark looked like he'd rather crawl under the rug. Carol didn't care. Her world had just imploded, and her mother was standing in the rubble, acting like she'd done her a favor. "I love him," Carol said, her voice low but fierce. "Do you understand that? I love Chris." Linda's lips parted, surprise flickering across her face. "Love? After only 8 months?" Carol's hands clenched at her sides. "Yes, love. And you just drove him away." Linda opened her mouth, but Carol didn't wait to hear it. She grabbed her coat, her purse, and stormed out the door, leaving the stunned trio behind. Outside, the night air hit her like a slap. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed Chris's number. It rang, and then his voicemail picked up. "Chris, it's me," she said, her voice breaking. Please call me. I'm so sorry." She hung up, staring at the dark street, her heart pounding like a drum. For the first time in years, Carol felt powerless, and she hated it. Meanwhile, across town, Chris sat in his apartment, staring at the blank wall like it held answers. His jacket lay crumpled on the couch, his coffee still bitter on his tongue. He wasn't angry. Not exactly. Anger was hot, sharp. This was something colder. A quiet ache that settled deep in his chest. He liked Carol. More than liked her. He'd pictured a future with her. One that didn't involve lawyers or prenups or bitter custody battles. But tonight had been a wake-up call. He'd fought hard to keep his life simple, drama-free. And Linda Bennet? She was a storm he couldn't outrun. His phone buzzed. Carol's name lit up the screen. He stared at it, thumb hovering, then let it go to voicemail. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Carol sat in her car outside his building an hour later, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her together. She'd left 3 messages. No response. She closed her eyes, whispering to the empty car. "I'm not giving up on you, Chris." And for the first time since the door slammed shut, she felt a spark of determination. If her mother thought she could dictate Carol's life, She was about to learn otherwise. Chapter 7. Fallout and Resolve. Carol didn't wait until morning. She stormed into her mother's house like a hurricane, the front door slamming against the wall. Linda looked up from the kitchen island, where she was calmly slicing strawberries as if nothing catastrophic had happened the night before. "Carol," Linda said, her tone maddeningly serene. "You're up early." Carol's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare act like everything's fine." Linda set the knife down, folding her hands with infuriating grace. "Sweetheart, I know you're upset, but..." "Upset?" Carol laughed, sharp and bitter. "You humiliated me. You humiliated Chris. You turned dinner into a matchmaking ambush." Linda's brows lifted, her expression the picture of calm authority. "I was trying to help you." "Help me?" Carol's hands clenched at her sides. "By parading some guy in front of me like I'm shopping for a better model?" Linda's lips curved in that faint, patronizing smile Carol had hated since high school. "You're emotional right now. When you calm down, you'll see I was only looking out for your future." Carol's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "My future is mine, not yours." Linda blinked as if the concept were foreign. "I just don't want you to make the same mistakes I did." Carol's chest heaved. "You think Chris is a mistake?" Linda hesitated, and that hesitation was louder than any word. "I think you could do better." Carol stared at her mother, something inside her breaking clean in two. "Better than someone who respects me? Who makes me laugh? Who treats me like I matter?" Linda's silence was answer enough. Carol grabbed her purse, her voice trembling with fury and heartbreak. "You don't get to decide who's good enough for me. Not anymore." And then she was gone, the door slamming behind her like a gunshot. Across town, Chris sat on his couch, staring at the muted glow of his TV. A sitcom played in the background, laugh track echoing through the room, but he wasn't listening. His mind was a storm of logic and longing. He'd done the right thing. He knew that. Walking out had been self-preservation. He'd spent years building a life free of chaos, and Linda Bennet was chaos incarnate. If he stayed, he'd be signing up for a lifetime of interference, drama, and passive-aggressive warfare. But then there was Carol. Carol with her quick wit and easy laugh. Carol who made him feel like maybe, just maybe, love didn't have to be a gamble that cost half your life. He wanted her. God, he wanted her. But wanting wasn't enough. Not when the battlefield included her mother. His phone buzzed again. Carol's name lit up the screen. He stared at it, thumb hovering, then pressed ignore. Not because he didn't care. Because he cared too much. Carol sat in her car outside his building for the second night in a row, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her together. She'd left messages, texts, even a voicemail that ended with her crying. Nothing. She closed her eyes, whispering to the empty car. "I'm not giving up on you, Chris." And for the first time since the door slammed shut, she felt something stronger than heartbreak. Resolve. If her mother thought she could dictate Carol's life, she was about to learn otherwise. Carol Bennet was done playing defense. It was time to fight for what she wanted. Chapter 8. The grand gesture. Carol didn't knock. She couldn't. If she knocked, she might lose her nerve. Instead, she marched straight up to Chris's apartment door, heart pounding like a drumline, and jabbed the doorbell like it owed her money. Inside, footsteps. Then the door opened, and there he was, Chris Thompson, looking tired, rumpled, and devastatingly handsome in a t-shirt and jeans. His eyes widened when he saw her. "Carol," he said slowly, like her name was a question. She pushed past him before he could protest, her heels clicking against the hardwood. "We need to talk." Chris closed the door, turning to face her. "Carol?" "No." She spun around, fire in her eyes. "You don't get to walk out and then ignore me like I'm spam email." Chris blinked. "Spam email?" "Yes." She threw her hands up. "You've been ghosting me for 2 days. 2 days. Do you know what that does to a person?" Chris rubbed the back of his neck, looking torn between amusement and exasperation. "Carol, I needed space." "Space?" She stepped closer, jabbing a finger at his chest. "You don't need space. You need to listen." Chris stared at her, silent. Carol took a deep breath, her voice trembling but fierce. "I love you." The words hung in the air like fireworks, bright and undeniable. Chris froze, his expression unreadable. Carol pressed on, her voice cracking. "I love you, Chris, and I'm not letting my mother ruin this. She doesn't get to decide who's good enough for me. You do. We do." Chris swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "Carol, no." She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know you're scared. I know you've been burned before. But I'm not her. I'm not anyone else. I'm me. And I want you." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then, just as Carol felt her heart splintering, Chris spoke. "You make it sound so simple," he said softly. Carol laughed through her tears. "It is simple. You love me back, right?" Chris's lips curved into a faint smile. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "I do." Carol's breath hitched. "Then stop overthinking and kiss me." Chris didn't hesitate. He closed the distance in 2 strides, his hands cupping her face, and kissed her like a man who'd been holding back for far too long. The world fell away. The doubts, the drama, the passive-aggressive dinner parties, and for one perfect moment, there was only them. The kiss broke with a laugh, Carol's, breathless and giddy. "Finally," she whispered. "Do you know how hard it was not to tackle you the first time we met?" Chris grinned, his forehead resting against hers. "You should've. Would've saved us 8 months of slow burns and bad dinners." Carol chuckled, wiping her cheeks. "Speaking of dinners, I'm never eating at my mother's house again." Chris smirked. "Deal." Just then, a loud knock rattled the door. Carol jumped. Chris groaned. "If that's your mother, I'm moving to Canada." Carol peeked through the peephole and burst out laughing. "It's Mrs. Patel from next door. She says your TV is too loud." Chris sighed, muttering, "Perfect timing." Carol grinned, tugging him toward the couch. "Ignore her. We've got bigger things to figure out." Chris raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Carol's smile softened. "Like how we make this work, without letting anyone else drive the car." Chris nodded slowly, his hand finding hers. "I think I can live with that." Chapter 9. The ultimatum. Chris had never been good at ultimatums. They always sounded harsh, like something you'd throw down in a courtroom or a hostage negotiation. But as he sat across from Carol on his couch, her knees tucked under her, her eyes wide and hopeful, he knew this wasn't about drama. It was about survival, the survival of them. Carol broke the silence first. "So, what happens now?" Chris leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped like he was about to deliver a TED Talk on emotional boundaries. "We need rules." Carol blinked. "Rules?" "Yes." He nodded, serious as a man drafting a constitution. "If we're going to make this work, there have to be boundaries." Carol tilted her head, a smile tugging at her lips. "You sound like you're negotiating a treaty." Chris smirked. "Feels like it." She laughed softly, but her expression sobered when he didn't. "Okay, what kind of boundaries?" Chris took a breath. "Number 1. No more ambush dinners. Ever." Carol winced. "Fair." "Number 2. If your mom has something to say about me, she says it to you, not through passive-aggressive comments at the dinner table." Carol nodded. "Agreed." "Number 3. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You have to stand up for us. For me. I can't fight this battle alone." Carol's throat tightened. "Chris, I'm not asking you to cut her out," he said quickly. "She's your mom. I get that. But if she keeps trying to sabotage us and you let her, I can't do it." "I won't." Carol stared at him, her heart pounding. "Are you saying if I don't, you'll walk away?" Chris met her gaze, steady and calm. "I'm saying if this turns into a war zone every time we see her, it's not a relationship. It's a hostage situation." Carol let out a shaky laugh. "You're really bad at romantic metaphors." Chris smiled faintly. "I'm better at honesty." Carol swallowed hard, then reached for his hand. "I'll do it. I'll stand up to her." "I already did." Chris raised an eyebrow. "You did." Carol nodded, her voice fierce. "I told her she doesn't get to decide who's good enough for me. I told her I love you." Chris's chest tightened. "You said that?" Carol smiled through tears. "I did. And I meant it." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Soft, heavy, full of things unsaid. Then Chris squeezed her hand, his voice low. "I love you too." Carol's breath hitched. "Then we're okay?" Chris nodded slowly. "We're okay. As long as we're on the same team." Carol grinned, wiping her cheeks. "Same team. Got it." Just then, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. Chris glanced at the screen and groaned. "Speak of the devil." Carol peeked. "Mom." Chris sighed. "Yep." Carol snatched the phone before he could answer, hit ignore, and tossed it onto the couch. "Rule number 4, she said, her smile wicked. "No answering calls from my mother during romantic negotiations." Chris laughed, pulling her into his arms. "Deal." Chapter 10. Mom versus Love. Carol didn't knock this time either. She walked straight into her mother's kitchen like a woman on a mission, heels clicking like gunfire. Linda looked up from her laptop, her expression calm. Too calm. "Carol," Linda said smoothly. "I was just about to call you." Carol dropped her purse on the counter with a thud. "Don't bother. We're talking now." Linda closed the laptop, folding her hands like a queen awaiting a petition. "Sweetheart, if this is about last night, it's about every night," Carol snapped. "Every dinner, every comment, every time you've tried to undermine my relationship." Linda's brows arched, her tone maddeningly serene. "I was only trying to protect you." Carol laughed, sharp and bitter. "Protect me? From what? Happiness?" Linda's lips curved faintly. "From heartbreak." Carol leaned forward, her voice low and fierce. "You think Chris is heartbreak? He's the best thing that's happened to me in years." Linda's silence was louder than any argument. Carol pressed on, her words tumbling out like bullets. "I love him. And if you can't accept that, then you're going to lose more than a fight, you're going to lose me." Linda blinked as if the concept were foreign. "Carol." "No." Carol shook her head, tears brimming but her voice steady. You don't get to control my life. Not anymore. I'm done letting you dictate who's good enough. Chris is good enough. He's more than good enough. And if you can't see that, that's your problem, not mine. For a moment, Linda just stared at her daughter, the weight of years pressing between them. Then, slowly, her shoulders sagged. You really love him? Carol's throat tightened. Yes. Linda exhaled, the fight draining from her eyes. Then, I suppose I owe you an apology. Carol blinked, stunned. You what? Linda gave a small, rueful smile. I've been so afraid of you making my mistakes that I forgot you're not me. Carol's tears spilled over, but her laugh was shaky and real. You think? Linda chuckled softly, reaching for her daughter's hand. I'll try, Carol. I can't promise perfection, but I'll try. Carol squeezed her mother's fingers, relief washing over her like sunlight after a storm. That's all I need. Meanwhile, across town, Chris sat in a booth at his favorite diner, nursing a coffee while his best friend, Jake, demolished a stack of pancakes like a man training for an eating contest. So let me get this straight, Jake said, mouth full. You walked out because her mom tried to set her up with Mr. Finance Guy? Chris sighed. It wasn't just that. It was months of passive-aggressive digs. I felt like I was auditioning for a job I didn't want. Jake grinned. And yet, here you are, sulking like a man who wants the job. Chris shot him a look. I'm not sulking. Jake snorted. You're brooding. It's like sulking with better posture. Chris rubbed his temples. I don't want drama. Jake leaned back, smirking. Buddy, drama's part of the package. You want love without chaos? Date a houseplant. Chris laughed despite himself. You're a terrible therapist. Jake raised his coffee in salute. And yet, you keep coming back. Chris shook his head, but the smile lingered. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe love wasn't about avoiding storms. It was about finding someone worth weathering them with. And Carol? She was worth every storm. Chapter 11. Chris's leap. Chris stared at the small velvet box on his coffee table like it was a live grenade. Inside was a ring, simple, elegant, nothing flashy. He'd bought it that morning after pacing the jewelry store for 45 minutes, muttering to himself like a man debating whether to jump off a cliff. Now, hours later, he still wasn't sure if he was brave or insane. Jake's voice echoed in his head. You want love without chaos? Date a houseplant. Chris smirked. He'd never been good with plants. But Carol? She was sunlight and storms all rolled into one. And somehow, he couldn't imagine life without her. He picked up the box, flipped it open, and stared at the ring again. It wasn't about the metal or the stone. It was about the promise, the risk he'd sworn he'd never take again. Marriage was a gamble, a legal contract with escape clauses written in heartbreak. He knew that better than most. But then he thought about Carol's laugh. The way she scrunched her nose when she was thinking hard. The way she'd stood in his apartment 2 nights ago, fire in her eyes, saying, I love you, and I'm not letting my mother ruin this. Chris exhaled slowly. Maybe love wasn't about avoiding storms. Maybe it was about finding someone worth getting drenched for. Carol was at her desk when her phone buzzed. She glanced down and froze. Chris, dinner tonight? My place. 7. Dress nice. Her heart skipped. Dress nice? That was new. She typed back quickly. Carol, is this a trap? Chris, maybe. But the good kind. Carol grinned, her pulse racing. She didn't know what he was planning, but she knew one thing. She wasn't missing it. At 7 sharp, Carol knocked on his door. Chris opened it, looking unfairly handsome in a navy blazer and crisp white shirt. The apartment smelled amazing. Garlic, butter, something roasting in the oven. Carol raised an eyebrow. You cooked. Chris smiled. Don't sound so shocked. She stepped inside, taking in the candles, the neatly set table, the soft music playing in the background. Wow, she said. Either you're buttering me up for bad news, or, Chris said, pulling out her chair. I'm trying to make tonight special. Dinner was perfect. Steak, roasted vegetables, wine that tasted expensive. But Carol barely tasted any of it. Chris was different, calm, focused like a man with something big on his mind. When dessert came, a slice of chocolate cake, Chris stood, walked around the table and dropped to one knee. Carol's fork clattered against the plate. Chris. He opened the velvet box, revealing the ring. His voice was steady, but his eyes were bright. I've spent months trying to outthink this, trying to make it safe. But love isn't safe. It's a risk, and you're the only risk I want to take. Carol's breath hitched, tears spilling before she could stop them. Are you? I'm asking, Chris said softly. Will you marry me? Carol laughed through her tears, the sound bubbling up like champagne. Yes, she whispered. Yes, you ridiculous, overthinking man. Yes. Chris slid the ring onto her finger, stood, and kissed her like the world had just tilted into place. The candles flickered, the music swelled, and for the first time in years, Chris felt like he wasn't losing half his life. He was gaining everything. Chapter 12. The proposal twist. Carol couldn't stop staring at the ring. It sparkled under the soft glow of the candles, a perfect circle of promise on her finger. She laughed, giddy and breathless, as Chris poured them both another glass of wine. "I can't believe you did this," she said, shaking her head. "You, the man who practically wrote a manifesto on why marriage is a legal death trap." Chris smirked, clinking his glass against hers. "Turns out my manifesto had a loophole." Carol grinned. "And what's that?" He leaned in, his voice low and warm. "You." Her heart melted all over again. She kissed him, slow and sweet, before pulling back with a mischievous glint in her eye. "So, when do we tell people?" Chris groaned. "Do we have to?" Carol laughed. "Yes, Chris. Engagements aren't like Fight Club. You're supposed to talk about them." Chris sighed dramatically. "Fine. Who first?" Carol hesitated, biting her lip. "My mom." Chris froze mid-sip. "You're kidding." Carol shook her head. "She needs to hear it from me. And before you panic, I'm not asking you to come with me." Chris exhaled in relief. "Thank God." Carol chuckled, pulling out her phone. "Here goes nothing," Linda answered on the second ring, her voice smooth as silk. "Carol?" "Hi, Mom." Carol swallowed hard. "I have news." Linda's tone sharpened instantly. "What kind of news?" Carol took a deep breath. "Chris proposed." I said yes. Silence. Long, heavy silence. Carol could practically hear the gears turning in her mother's head. Finally, Linda spoke, her voice tight. "You're engaged." "Yes," Carol said firmly. "And before you say anything, I love him. He makes me happy. That's all that matters." Another pause. Then, to Carol's shock, Linda laughed. A soft, rueful sound. "Well, I suppose congratulations are in order." Carol blinked. "Wait, what?" Linda sighed. "I may not have handled things well, but if you're happy, that's what counts." Carol's jaw dropped. "Who are you and what have you done with my mother?" Linda chuckled. "Don't push it." Carol laughed, relief flooding her chest. "Thanks, Mom. Just promise me one thing," Linda said. "Don't let him wear sneakers to the wedding." Carol grinned. "Deal." Across town, Chris was on the phone with Jake, who was shouting so loudly the neighbors probably heard. "You proposed. You, Mr. Marriage is a trap, actually proposed." Chris rubbed his forehead, grinning despite himself. "Yeah, Jake, I did." Jake hooped like a man who just won the lottery. "This is huge. I need details. Did you get down on one knee? Did she cry? Did you cry?" Chris chuckled. "She cried. I didn't." Jake snorted. "Liar. You totally cried." Chris smiled, staring at the ring box now empty on the table. "Maybe a little." Jake laughed. "Man, I'm proud of you. You finally stopped overthinking and jumped." Chris leaned back, his voice soft. "Yeah, and it feels right." Later that night, Carol curled up beside him on the couch, her head on his shoulder, her ring catching the light like a tiny star. "So," she murmured. "What's next?" Chris kissed her hair, his smile slow and certain. "Chaos, but the good kind." Carol laughed, her heart full. For the first time in months, everything felt possible. Chapter 13. Happily imperfect. The wedding wasn't perfect. Carol had accepted that early on, around the time the florist called to say the peonies were having a supply chain crisis, and Linda suggested, very seriously, that they switch to silk flowers for elegance and longevity. Chris had laughed so hard he nearly choked on his coffee. "Silk flowers? What's next? A hologram cake." Carol threw a pillow at him. "Don't tempt fate." The big day arrived with all the glorious chaos of a rom-com finale. The venue was stunning. A sunlit garden strung with fairy lights. But the details? A comedy of errors. The cake was late. The DJ played the wrong first dance song. A 90s boy band hit instead of their chosen ballad. Jake forgot his speech and improvised something that sounded suspiciously like a stand-up routine about Chris's fear of commitment. And then he said marriage was a legal death trap. Jake announced to roaring laughter. Look at him now, voluntarily signing up for lifetime chaos. "Give it up for my man Chris." Chris buried his face in his hands while Carol laughed so hard she cried. Linda, to everyone's shock, behaved. Mostly. She wore a tasteful dress, smiled for photos, and only made one comment about how nice Mark looked in his suit when she spotted him among the guests. Carol shot her a look that could melt steel. Linda raised her glass in surrender. Later, as Carol hugged her mother goodbye, Linda whispered, "You were right. He's good for you." Carol smiled softly. "Thanks, Mom." Linda smirked. "Just promise me one thing." Carol groaned. "What now?" "No sneakers at the honeymoon." Carol laughed, shaking her head. "Deal." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Chris pulled Carol onto the dance floor, ignoring the DJ's questionable playlist. He held her close, his voice low against her ear. "Still think marriage is a legal death trap?" she teased. Chris grinned. "Only if you marry the wrong person." "And me." He kissed her, slow and certain. "You're the loophole." Carol laughed, her heart full. Around them, friends cheered, lights twinkled, and the music swelled. It wasn't perfect, not even close, but it was theirs, and that was everything.